Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis coming back for the first time in, a couple weeks here?
Yeah,
Not a
2
lot has
weeks.
happened in that time, though. So we'll see what we can get through. We do still have a little bit of news to go over relating to the Brewers, but for the most part, the slow offseason continuing. But before we get that far into our content, Spencer, I could ask you how you're doing, but my understanding is it hasn't been so smooth for you this week.
Yeah, it has, it's not been a very fun week for me. Woke up about 2 hours into my sleep yesterday with a pretty bad fever, shaking all just all of it, everything you could ask for with a fever, and then I got, like, next to 0 sleep the next night. I feel a lot better now, but I am very, very tired, so, hopefully past the actual sickness, but I'm quite tired, so I'm gonna try and keep the energy up for this. I can always bring it up for some Brewers talk, but, yeah, in general, not the most fun week for me.
I'm going to ask you this because I feel like it's a different answer depending on who you talk to. How often do you get sick every year?
Well, I can say this, I almost always get sick right around this time. I'm convinced it's because of the coaching job and coming back to about 40 different people who have brought germs from all over the place back to being around me, but I would say actually sick only probably 3 or 4 times. I mean, I might get the occasional little cold or whatever throughout the year, but actual, a fever even probably once a year, I would say maybe twice.
I used to know a guy in high school who would get sick like practically like once a month. And it was always an interesting dynamic because I've always been the guy who like never gets sick. And I'm not saying that to brag or anything, or maybe I am. Maybe that's why I'm telling the story. But there was one instance in high school where he got like a cold flu type thing, and it knocked him out for probably like a week. And he started coming down with it while he was still at school, and then he a couple days later stayed home because it kept getting worse. So he gave it to me, but I acquired it after he did, and I basically just had like the sniffles for like 2 days, and then I felt better again before he was even like back at school. So that had to be a big, running joke between the two of us that he's the guy who always gets really sick. I'm the one who, for some reason, does not get sick because I generally don't live like the healthiest lifestyle in terms of like exercising as much as I should or eating super healthy. Like I probably shouldn't be someone who rarely gets sick, but I guess it's just kind of hardwired into your genes or your biology. But that had to be like the inside joke for us. The fact that he's the one who gets super sick. I'm somehow blessed with like I don't know, the greatest immune system ever or something. I don't know what it is, but this was a sickness that he gave me, and somehow I got it after he got it and got better way sooner than he did. So we'll get off of that tangent though and dive into some of the topics that we're going to talk about this week. We'll start with, believe it or not, a free agent signing. The catch, though, is that it is still not a guaranteed free agent signing. So the Brewers still have not spent a guaranteed dollar in MLB free agency this year, but they signed Elvin Rodriguez to a partially guaranteed deal. So it's another kind of one of these where it's a big league deal, but he's got options left. There's only a certain amount of money that's guaranteed. There is a team option for 2026, depending on how Rodriguez performs. But the terms that have been reported, he's only guaranteed $300,000. He can get up to $900,000 in 2025, depending on performance and different things like that. He does have 2 minor league options remaining. So again, another guy who the Brewers could put on the roster, or this could just easily end up being a situation somewhat similar to Grant Wolfram, where they're signing a guy who they can shuttle between the big leagues and AAA. I wouldn't be surprised if that's how they use them, at least early on. We've talked a lot on this show throughout the offseason about how the Brewers are probably going to want, some optionable guys who they can do that with. The interesting aspect of this one, though, is to make room for him on the 40-man roster. They DFA'd a guy who still has an option left in JB Bukauskas. And it hurt me to see that one because I've been a very big JB Bukauskas believer. Spencer, I think you're with me on that one. But I really
Mhm.
like the heavy sinker that he really didn't. He started developing it before the Brewers acquired him, but once he got here, a couple of their AAA pitching coaches, he had told me that they really helped him really get that pitch to where it was now, where he was sitting like 0 inches of induced vert, so like a true heavy sinker. in the mid to upper 90s, good slider with some sweep to go with it, but just could not stay healthy last year. And when I see a guy like that get DFA'd, that tells me that the health prognosis for him is probably not looking very good right now. That's just my speculation. But generally speaking, a guy who has that kind of upside and did look good in the very, very limited time he got with the Brewers, to have a guy like that not only being DFA'd, but then clearing waivers and agreeing to accept an outright here instead of going to free agency.
Yeah.
I would be willing to guess there's something going on here where like the opportunities just were not going to be there with anybody. So he'll still be in the system. I am curious to see if we're going to get any news about him, especially once the Brewers report for spring training and some stuff starts to come out there. But back to Rodriguez. Well, if you're watching on video, we'll kind of pull up a graphic here just to give you an idea of his arsenal, because this is the kind of stuff that we usually break down when we're talking about a signing like this. So we have the graphic up on video here, but we'll also run through it over audio just so everyone can kind of get a better idea of it. Basically, he pitched overseas last year. He was in Japan in the NPB, and I shouldn't say the NPB. It's like MLB. It's just NPB. Professional baseball in Japan. I always get really upset at people who say the MLB, and now I'm doing the same thing with the league overseas. But last year, he had a really, really successful season. I don't have the numbers up in front of me. I should have pulled up his baseball reference page, but I believe he had an ERA below 2.
Yeah.
When he was pitching over there. He did split the year between their highest level of affiliated ball and kind of like their minor leagues, but he had like an ERA below 2 at both levels, I believe, if memory's serving me correctly. But again, what I'm more interested in is looking at the arsenal. And this one is interesting to me because at first glance, there's nothing surprising here. He's been a kitchen sink guy. He was a kitchen sink guy in Japan last year, and that's because he was in a little bit of a hybrid role. He's been a starter for most of his career stateside. He did pitch exclusively out of the bullpen last year. Again, I don't have the innings total in front of me, but I think there were some multi-inning outings mixed in there, if I'm remembering correctly. But either way, this is the arsenal of a guy who has experience in a little bit more of a stretched out role. So there's a couple different directions the Brewers could go here. If they want him to be kind of like a swing guy or at least a multi-inning reliever, you're probably going to see them keep this entire arsenal. So it's four-seam fastball, knuckle curve, slider, cutter, changeup, and then like the occasional sinker. This says he only threw it 3.5% of the time last year over there. So that always leaves me wondering, was it actually a sinker or did he just fire off a couple of four-seamers that maybe were a little less verty with some more run and they just got classified like that? But at the very least, you're looking at a 5-pitch mix, maybe 6 if there actually is another fastball there. But when you look at this whole arsenal, it's really just the four-seamer and the slider that jump out. The four-seamer, the last time he was in the big leagues, he averaged 20 inches of induced vertical break on it. But he is a fairly traditional over-the-top guy, so that does get mitigated a little bit. The numbers that we have up in front of us here, so this is kind of like his baseball savant from Japan, basically. And if you're looking at the graphic, you can kind of see the credit from the web app that we got this from. But the four-seamer over there, the stuff plus was 125, and the whiff rate against it was a little bit over 20%. So it was solid over there. My guess is when he comes over here, you're probably going to see it be a little bit less effective. It's probably not going to really be an extraordinary pitch, but like a decent fastball. But the slider is what jumps out to me. So opponents in Japan at their big league level, basically, against his slider, they whiffed nearly 45% of the time. 45% of their swings basically were swings and misses. And the stuff plus grade for it was 169. So this was like an elite slider for the standards of what they have over there. And we don't have shape data here, but I'm curious to see what the shape was like, because in the big leagues, he has used both the shorter slider and a little bit of a longer one with a little bit more lateral movement. The whiff rate being this high has me wondering if he went back to a little bit of a shorter one, because sometimes it kind of depends from one specific pitch to the next for each pitcher. But sometimes those longer sliders can be a little bit more about just getting off the barrel as opposed to lesser movement, but that movement comes later in the trajectory on a shorter slider. Those are sometimes the ones where you actually see a little bit more swing and miss. But again, it kind of depends on this combination of like velocity and movement and when the movement's, coming into play here. But bottom line, graded out extremely well over there. Fantastic whiff rate on it. Fantastic results in general. The curveball is in the mix too. And what's interesting to me is basically his usage of these two pitches was roughly the same overall. He was a little bit more slider against righties and quite a bit more curveball against lefties. But the curveball did not get any swing and miss. It was mainly more for getting some rollovers. The ground ball rate on it looks pretty good. Over like he's pushing almost 70% ground ball rate on this curveball. But I think that if the Brewers are looking at him strictly as a reliever and they're going for upside here, I'm almost tempted to just condense this whole arsenal down to fastball slider or pretty close. And, maybe the curve stays in there as a show me. The cutter was really, really bad last year for him overseas. And if you've already got like the slider and the curve, I'm not sure you really need that. So if he's like strict relief, I'm taking that out of the mix. He's got a change up too. We just really haven't seen enough of that to know quite what to expect from it, in my opinion. That's going to be kind of a thing where, if you get early in the year, maybe you can get a little bit more shape data on it and see where it's at. But if he's pitching out of the bullpen, you also don't necessarily need to have a changeup to be effective and to get through, a handful of guys at a time once through an order. So what's interesting to me is there's basically two directions they can go with this. If they want to go like upside reliever, and there is some upside here, like this is a guy who has a decent velocity. Like we said, there's ride on the fastball. The slider looks really, really good. So if you condense the mix a little bit and basically just boil it down to like four-seamer, a lot of sliders. He only threw the slider 13% of the time last year overseas. If he's here, like I would almost get this to the point of like slider is going to be your main pitch, like more sliders than fastballs out of the bullpen at the very least. If you do that, and then, it's a lot of sliders, quite a few four-seamers, and then maybe you drop a curve in if you're looking for a rollover, or you can still go a little more curved at lefties, then there's quite a bit of upside here out of the bullpen. And, we tend to say this with a lot of guys, but I'll say it again here. Like there is a path where, there's some leverage upside here. But if they see him as more of a guy who's going to be in kind of a flex role, maybe they try to build him up a little bit in spring training just for some depth, then you're probably going to see them keep this entire arsenal, and they're going to switch to something we'll talk about later in the show about how they really like the fully developed arsenals and trying to tunnel it really well to help you be not a great starter, but like a passable one who can navigate an order multiple times, even if the stuff doesn't necessarily play amazing in more of that stretched out form. So to me, it's interesting because there's a couple different routes they can go. And again, they don't have to roster him in the big leagues necessarily because he has those options remaining. Sometimes with these kind of deals, there might be a clause in there about like, no, he needs to be on the roster, or there's clauses about like club control. The Brewers have had those kinds of things in past deals, but it doesn't seem like this deal has any of that. So they do still get a lot of flexibility here. But Spencer, I've talked for a while here. I'm curious if you have any different thoughts or just kind of what your takeaway is here. Because like when I first looked at this, I was kind of like, this. I don't know. It's a guy, like he doesn't really do anything for me. But now that I like notice the slider a little more, that's what jumps out to me. Everything else is, I don't know. There's a couple different ways they can go with this.
Yeah, I don't disagree with really anything you said. I will say the last time we saw him in affiliated ball, the changeup was playing pretty well for him. I have some of the numbers up. It was, 15. It's a high spin changeup. So over 2,000 RPMs on the changeup, which is interesting. But in AAA, it had a 37% whiff rate on, over 100 pitches thrown with it. So it was used a little bit more heavily than it was overseas when he was stateside last time. But it's a very interesting profile. I think it's, like you said, they could go either direction. My guess is they're going to go the relief route with him. I think that's more where they would look. And I will note, I looked it up while you were talking, but he threw 49 games in Japan last year and he threw 88 innings. So it was all out of the pen, but most of them were most likely multi-innings. So that gives him flexibility. You wonder if maybe they're going to try, the Bryce Wilson type of role with him, somebody like that. But he's definitely interesting. I think you're exactly right that it feels like the sliders, what they're going to want to maybe build off of around a little bit more. 13% when it's getting, that good of results, when the stuff is legitimately that good as well. That almost makes you question a little bit why he wasn't throwing it more over there. It feels like anybody would have been able to pick up on how well it was performing and that he probably should be using it a little more. But either way, it's an interesting mix. Like you said, it's at least 5 pitches. I think you could argue, 4 of them are decent. And 3 of them are probably pretty good if you include the changeup, and that minimally you can really build around the 4-seam and the slider, like you said. So it's an interesting pickup. I always like when the Brewers, I love when you have a random signing like this pop up out of nowhere, because the Brewers did the research, that they have something they're very they're very keyed in on what they want to do with this guy. And like you said, I think they can go a bunch of different ways with it, but it'll be interesting to find out what they do with him when we get into spring. I'm assuming he will probably be in Nashville to start the year, considering he has that flexibility and everything else that comes with this contract. But it's an interesting arm. I think it's one of those guys, like you said, where if you pull the right strings, if he kind of maximizes what he's good at, he's the type of arm who could be a bit more of a leverage guy. And if not, like I said, you might get a Bryce Wilson out of the pen type of role from him, where he could give you 3 innings in a not super close game, or even just a short start from your starter where you need a decent 3 innings from a reliever to kind of bridge the gap. It's not the most exciting signing in the world, but I think it's pretty interesting. And I do think there's definitely something here where I could see it working out pretty decently for the Brewers. And, for a guy like this was somebody who the Rays targeted a few years ago. I always kind of come back to that when I see teams like the Rays or the Guardians, those types of teams, the Yankees. When those teams go after a guy and the Brewers also go after a guy, that means there's definitely something that these smart pitching organizations are seeing when there's overlap. Even a Tobias Myers is a good example of that. He was both of the Rays and the Guardians before the Brewers, and neither of them were completely able to unlock him, but the Brewers were able to find a little bit of a different gear with him and help him get to his best self. So I always note that. But yeah, overall, it's low risk, and I think there's decently high reward on the potential scale here. So pretty fun signing from our perspective. Like I said, probably not the most fun signing for most fans out there, but for guys like us, we always enjoy these types of signings. And just to quickly touch on Bukauskas, I was happy to see that he did stick around in the organization, but I do agree with you. I feel like this has to be health related, that 1, he wasn't claimed, and 2, he was even DFA'd to begin with. It just, the Brewers hung on to him all year last year, despite all the health stuff. I think hoping that he would be able to come back this year, and the fact that they ended up DFAing him this late in the offseason has me, just reading the tea leaves, it feels like there's probably something not great there with his arm. So hopefully we're wrong. Hopefully, especially now that he's sticking in the organization. I do think there's definitely something there with Bukauskas if he can stay healthy. So, yeah.
Sticking on the pitching front and getting to what I teased a few minutes ago, we're going to pivot to, kind of what the Brewers probably would be looking at if they were to put Rodriguez in a little bit more of a stretched out role. So I'll pull up this other graph here if you're watching on video. This is from a story I did on this a few days ago, last week actually. And basically, we're in an era now where everything is now about how do we try to evaluate pitches with all-encompassing numbers, or at least close to that as best we can, because the information era of pitching and baseball analytics in general, it has grown exponentially, especially in the public sphere over the last several years, over the last probably a decade now. And there's so many different numbers to look at, so many different ways to combine those numbers with each other to try to figure out what you're looking at, trying to figure out what is it that makes a guy effective, because the mix is going to be a little bit different for every guy. And these new models that Baseball Prospectus just rolled out, they don't make that not the case. I mean, it's still a different, mix of what makes every guy good. And I'll note before we jump into these, like if you look at the actual leaderboard, or at least the top of the leaderboard that they had in the introductory piece for this, the introductory story, there's not a particularly, in fact, there isn't any correlation really from those names to the best pitchers in baseball. Like the names on that list, none of them, or at least very few of them, are actually like top line pitchers. They're all like okay, middle of the rotation, maybe back of the rotation type guy. I mean, like you had like Michael Lorenzen and Chris Bassett were the kind of guys topping this sort of leaderboard. And, those are guys who they're fine. They've managed to carve out a pretty good careers with stuff that doesn't seem to really be all that great on the surface. But what this is really helpful for, I think, is filling in the gaps of why guys who don't seem to have great stuff are still like doing okay. And this is really where the Brewers excelled in 2024. They built a pitching staff. More specifically, they built basically an entire starting rotation, or very close to it, on the fly in 2024, because they had so many injuries and so many things go wrong on those fronts. You had Tobias Myers emerging and stabilizing the rotation for a good chunk of the year. You had Colin Ray doing the same for most of the season before he fell apart in the season's final month. You brought Aaron Savali and Frankie Montas in mid-season, and you were able to get them to become passable middle of the rotation starters. Like the Brewers just kept doing this stuff with all of these kinds of guys. And as you try to kind of piece together, like, how did they make it work? This is something that kind of fills you in on, okay, maybe it wasn't all just, like a stroke of luck. So these new metrics from Baseball Prospectus, basically what they're trying to quantify is deception. And we knew that this was something that the Brewers valued, because I had talked to Chris Hook plenty about it. I had done a bunch of stories on it about how the Brewers like to mix like 3 fastball variants to try to keep guys off balance. Like they're very big on doing this kind of stuff. So we got a little bit of a sample peek here at the numbers for Brewers starters. And these are not fully available and sortable to the public yet, but we were able to get our hands on some of them for Brewers pitchers. And basically the theme when you go through this list is basically every pitcher the Brewers had on their roster at any point in the year, like pitchers who, when the Brewers brought them in, the intent was these are guys who can go multiple times through an order and be in a little bit more of a bulk role. Practically every single one of these guys graded out poorly in just stuff. So like for this, we're just using stuff plus, like their percentile of their stuff plus, but they graded out either above average or extremely well, like top of the league almost, in these like deception and pitch masking metrics. So the 4 metrics that Baseball Prospectus just launched are pitch type probability, surprise factor, movement spread, and velocity spread. So I'll run through these really quickly. And if you want more details, I would encourage you, number one, first and foremost, to read the article at BP. It's free to read, even if you're not a subscriber, and it gives you kind of a rundown of this stuff. And it does get a little bit more into the weeds on how they put this together. You can also read the story that I did on this, where I just gave a very brief overview of what these mean, in case you're, just looking for a little bit more of like a reading version of that, as opposed to listening to it on the podcast. But pitch type probability is basically the probability that a hitter will be able to successfully identify what kind of pitch he's seeing by the moment he must make a swing decision. So, I'm sure that most people have seen like the videos where, they do like the math on like exactly how much time you have to make a decision to get the bat around in time, how much time you have to swing, like all this stuff. And it's crazy low. Like I will always maintain that hitting a baseball especially at the big league level, is the hardest task in professional sports, just because there's not only so much hand-eye coordination, but the fact that it happens so quickly. So once that ball leaves the pitcher's hand, you have a minimal amount of time to decide. Like, you're going to have to make a swing decision basically by the time that ball is only like a quarter of the way to the plate. It might even be less than that because I don't have the actual numbers in front of me. But you can look at like graphics on Baseball Savant too, where they mark out like the decision time, like where in the ball's flight you need to make a decision. So pitch type probability is the odds that, or the likelihood that the hitter has or will be able to identify the pitch type by the time he needs to decide to swing. Surprise factor is basically when a pitch behaves in a manner that the batter would not be expecting. Like, the kind of movement he ends up seeing is not what he would expect based on all of like the other normal factors that you could account for. Movement spread and velocity spread are a little bit more simple. Movement spread is just like how big of a range of shapes do you have is basically the good way to describe it. Same thing for velocity spread, just kind of the range of velocities you have. Like, the distribution of movement and velocity is how they describe it in the story. But basically, you can just think of it as, okay, like I cover a lot of ground with the ranges of movements on my pitches. And then the same thing for velocity. So we have this chart up on video. Again, I'll run through it if you're just listening on audio. So it's like everybody the Brewers used in a bulk role this year. So we got Frankie Montas, Ray, Myers, Carlos Rodriguez, Robert Gasser, Bryce Wilson, Jansen Junk, Joe Ross, Mitch White, Savali, Eliezer Hernandez, remember him, Freddie Peralta, DL Hall, Aaron Ashby, Dallas Keuchel, and Jacob Junis. Out of all the guys on that list, and honestly, we can, no offense to Eliezer Hernandez, he only threw 6 innings, so we can probably throw him out. That leaves the only guy on this list with an above-average stuff plus, Freddie Peralta. Everybody else, by measure of stuff plus, so just the raw rating of their entire arsenal, just like thinking stuff. Does he have good stuff? Every other name on this list was either a little below average or well below average. Like, Colin Ray here is all the way down in the 6th percentile. Tobias Myers is in the 22nd percentile. Joe Ross is in the 17th percentile. Dallas Keuchel in the 4th percentile, but that one didn't work anyway because he's like the one name on this list who is just terrible at everything. But everybody else, none of them had good stuff. A lot of them not even close to it. But the vast majority of them either excelled in one category of these deception metrics or even all of them or most of them. So, like, we'll take Colin Ray, for example, because this is basically just like more proof of kind of what we had been saying about Colin Ray for most of the season. His stuff plus was in the 6th percentile last year. His pitch type probability was in the 97th percentile. His surprise factor was in the 93rd percentile. So basically what that means is nothing you were seeing from Colin Ray was a good pitch in and of itself. None of it was great stuff. But because he was so great at tunneling his pitches, throwing everything out of the same release point, and also this kind of just ties into like the trajectory of your pitches too. Like, just generally, if you have good, movement patterns that are compatible with each other, it'll also help you here as well. But basically, none of the stuff was good, but batters had an extremely difficult time. Like, a lot of times it was almost impossible to actually like identify by the time you needed to swing what pitch you were actually seeing. And again, like, you look at kind of how these factors mix with each other, like, okay, none of this stuff is good. Like, in and of itself, you would expect Colin Ray to get crushed. But because batters can't tell the pitch type, that didn't make him good. But in a lot of ways, like this crazy low pitch type probability and the crazy high surprise factor, this is basically like how Colin Ray misses the barrel just enough to find success. Because like these are bad pitches. Like, they're not good pitches. So like you would expect guys to crush them. And like, in a way, that's why even if they don't know right away what it is, like the pitch itself is still so bad for the most part that guys are able to make decent contact a good amount of the time. But like just that little bit of like putting them behind the 8 ball to start, that's kind of like what makes him serviceable against big league hitters Or if his command is really good like that, then you combine those factors, and that's when you get like the kind of run that he went on during the middle of the season, where all of a sudden he was striking more guys out over like a eight start stretch, and like the peripherals were actually looking pretty good, things like that. But and this is not just Colin Ray; he's the most extreme example. But like Frankie Montas, Tobias Myers as well. Tobias Myers like does not have great stuff either. But Tobias is really interesting to look at. I actually, after seeing this, went to Baseball Savant and like pulled up his release and trajectory like averages in the illustrator that they have on Baseball Savant, where it's like Statcast will give you like the average pitch trails of each of his pitch types and to the average location he threw it in, and it like overlays them all on each other. So you have like release points and then like ball flight trajectory. It's all overlaid. Everything looks like exactly the same. The separation is super late. So again, like nothing remarkable here. Yes, he's got like a lot of vert, but because he comes straight over the top, it doesn't quite have the same effect. It's super straight left and right. The secondaries are okay, but they're not like anything remarkable. But all of a sudden, like now the fastball slider combo that he would go to so often starts to make a little bit more sense why that was so effective, because this helps you quantify just how incredible the tunnel was for him. And he's not the only guy on this list. Like Robert Gasser is on this list as well, someone who only, made a handful of starts before Tommy John, but in that time, his pitch type probability was really good. And to me, this also adds a little bit more context to maybe why the Brewers all of a sudden had him going way more sinker once he got to the big leagues. Because I wonder if, like Hook and friends wanted to get him into this group now, and that was kind of their way of doing it against big league hitters. Bryce Wilson, bad stuff, pitch probability or pitch type probability in the 84th percentile. Like this is a theme for like all of these guys, even the ones who don't have like a great pitch type probability, their surprise factor's better, or they have like a huge movement spread. That's where Savali comes in here. Like not good stuff. The pitch type probability is not great, but the surprise factor is okay. The movement spread is in the 94th percentile. Like it's a slightly different mix for each guy, but the bottom line here is like the Brewers were really, really good at deception. So kind of this mold that they've set up for building their pitching staffs is in the bullpen. That's where we're going to have the stuff guys. By the way, if you were to look at this list for like the Brewers bullpen, it's the exact opposite. I didn't put it in this graphic, but the Brewers bullpen is exactly the opposite. The stuff is off the charts and the pitch type probability sucks, which is fine because like if you also have to understand what these metrics are for. It's made for evaluating like guys who have a lot of pitches and will pitch multiple times through. If you only have 2 pitches and you're like a sinker slider guy, generally speaking, like your pitch type probability is not going to be good. Or if you're like even like a 4-seam slider guy, like it's not going to be good, but it really doesn't matter. You just need to have 2 different speeds, and your stuff is so good from there that it works in short stints. So the list is mostly the opposite for the bullpen. But so that's how they're going to build their relief unit out, or they're going to find like something else that's kind of funky. It's just a tough angle to pick up in a small sample. And then they've built their rotation by almost like they've kind of found a little bit of like a market inefficiency here, where it's like, okay, we're going to load up on all of these guys who don't have great stuff. So they're going to get overlooked a little bit by like the stuff modeling that has become all the rage now. I will say though, like in Frankie's case, the Brewers seemingly their internal models actually thought his stuff was really good. So there's a little bit of disagreement there, but everybody else on this list, like no one's really going to argue that these guys have great stuff, but they're picking up these guys who don't have great stuff, but they know that either they're already really good at like, we'll call it like pitch masking, just for the sake of what we're talking about. I think everyone can kind of understand what that means. Like just doing something, whether it's with the release point or movements or a combination of everything that makes it really hard to identify the pitch right away out of your hand by the time you have to swing. They're picking up a bunch of guys who are either already really good at that, or what I'm interested in, what I want to know as these metrics get a little further along and we can start splitting them up by team. Because like this is only like for Montas and Savali, just the entire season. I'd be curious to know, does this get better after guys come to the Brewers? Because I'd be willing to bet that's probably the case too.
Yeah. I think as soon as I saw you wrote this article, the first thing I thought of was Aaron Savali adding the shorter slider after he came over. Yep. And just that was the immediate like first thought. I was like, oh, that explains a ton of why they did that. And then I read the article and I saw that you actually referenced that specific move, but like
any opportunity to bump my previous work and tie it into something else, I will absolutely take that chance. Got to get my
yeah,
clicks.
but like it fits perfectly.
And it just makes sense.
Yeah, it explains. I mean, it helps explain it. I mean, we got it at the time. It made sense too, but now we can quantify it a little bit more. Like you said, that really fits with the movement spread, I think. And like you said, it feels like this is something where the Brewers feel like they have a bit of a market inefficiency. And even like with their prospects, I wonder if they value some of their guys a little more highly than other teams might, like a Carlos Rodriguez, who did not grade out well stuff wise, but he, in his 12 innings in the big leagues, he graded out quite well in all four of the other categories here. So they might think, and I think part of it here is that his command was not very good in the big leagues. So that's obviously going to be a big part of it as well. But you can kind of see the vision here when you can compare him to the other guys who had success with a similar type of profile, like a Colin Ray and a Tobias Myers. And like you said, I think Montas, I would bet Montas grades out well on a lot of stuff models around the league. I mean, considering what he got paid this offseason, again,
Yeah.
I would bet teams around the league view him as good stuff plus having the ability for deception and all of these other things we're talking about here. But it definitely feels like, and I'd be curious. I mean, I will be curious to find out, what does a Connor Thomas look like once we start getting data on him? Because I would imagine that's part of what they saw in him when they made him a Rule 5 pick. And even a guy like Elvin Rodriguez, I wonder what they're, I'm sure they're grading some of this stuff out internally on deception. And it's probably not the exact same thing as what Prospectus is using here, but I would bet the Brewers have a pretty, I mean, they have a model that's similar to this, I would imagine. And it makes me wonder if they've been a little bit ahead of the curve on this. And now, maybe other teams will start catching up a little bit. The Brewers tend to find their way ahead of the curve pretty often. And then they kind of stay ahead of it. But it's all very interesting. I think, like you said, Freddie being the only actual regular to have above average stuff by, this stuff plus metric is kind of crazy when you think about it for the starting pitchers, because the rotation performed pretty well last year. It wasn't elite by any measure. It wasn't 2021, Corbin Burns, Brandon Woodruff, Freddie Peralta, but the rotation kept the Brewers in pretty much every game. And I think this does a really good job of kind of showing it with numbers why they were able to make it work, despite, like you said, a lot of these guys probably didn't have much value around the league because a lot of models probably wouldn't love them, because you'd look across and you'd be like, oh, I don't know, stuff's not very good. For a lot of these guys, the performance hadn't been great recently or in the past. Like, this isn't just they don't have great stuff, but they have been getting outs, at whatever level they've been at. That wasn't the case for a lot of them. Montas wasn't having a very good year before he came to the Brewers. Colin Ray had to go overseas before he came back to the Brewers. Tobias Myers was a minor league free agent. These are all, Bryce Wilson was traded for cash. I mean, there's a lot of different things here that the Brewers went out and saw value in these guys. And I would imagine a big part of it was this deception. And obviously we'll never really know, but I'd be very curious to see how they grade these things out internally, or what kind of, like, if they have similar, what their version of a surprise factor or anything along those lines would be, because I'm sure they have something along those lines. But yeah, overall, I think it gives a little bit of a peek behind the curtain as to what the Brewers' overall plan of attack has been when finding pitchers, especially, on the cheap, I guess I would say, on the lower side of just having to go out either in trade value or in free agency. They've been able to find some pretty good value, and it feels like this is a really big part of it.
The final note I'll make on this before we move on, and I wrote this in my story as well. The thing to keep in mind with whenever someone comes up with a metric like this, for the most part, it's not so much that we're discovering something new, but that we're discovering a way to quantify what a lot of baseball people could already kind of pick out with their eyes, or what was already kind of accepted as a real thing. Sometimes we do more research and we disprove that that phenomenon was actually a real thing, or that it actually had the impact people thought. But in situations like this, particularly when it comes to like pitch modeling, none of this is really, something new. Like I'll go back a few years ago. I guess this isn't strictly pitch modeling, it's more like pitch design. But like, last couple of years, all the rage has been guys are throwing sweepers, and I'll hear people say to me all the time, like, kind of skeptical that we invented a new pitch. No, we didn't invent a new pitch. This has always been around. There were always certain guys who could throw this. The difference now and why we're putting a name on it is because now we have enough technology and enough information to the point that instead of it just being, oh well, like this guy can just naturally throw one, we're not entirely sure why, but we know we can do it, so we'll keep doing it, and it's kind of something that is tied to his individual value. Now we have the tech to make this repeatable and replicable, so that's why we're now giving it a name and why we're now seeing more emphasis on it. This is kind of similar here in a way, because yes, we always knew like smart pitching was not only do you need to have good stuff, but like deception has always been an important part of pitching.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they talk about like having multiple pitch types. Trying to keep a consistent release point is a big deal for a lot of guys. Like pitch tunneling or like setting up a pitch with the pitch before. Like none of this is new. I do think in like modern baseball, we have seen because like we're now in an era where you can just develop raw stuff super well, that I think that's taken over is kind of the way to do it. And I don't necessarily think that's incorrect, because like at the end of the day, like having amazing stuff and like okay deception or below average deception,
Yeah.
you're probably going to get farther than you would the other way around, where if you have absolutely awful stuff, like again, I'll bring up Ray again, awful stuff, elite deception, league average starter. If you were to flip that combo around, and it's elite stuff and terrible deception, that's probably still a guy who, if he commands the ball well enough, is going to be a really good relief pitcher. Like it's, so like if we're trying to weigh these variables, I'm still weighing stuff more than I'm weighing deception. But now that we have a way to quantify deception, this means that we can look at it a little bit more scientifically, a little bit more reliably. Like once you can quantify something, it gets easier to properly evaluate it, to replicate it, different things like that. So that's really what's going on here. And that's just kind of the final point I wanted to make. We're not claiming that, like the nerds were, like ignoring something that we knew was the case, that now they like found it in reverse, proving the old heads right and the nerds are wrong. No, that's not what this is about. It's really just like, yes, we all knew this was something that was a thing, but now it's even nicer that we can have some numbers to back it up, because
Yes.
once you have that, now, that concept becomes even more useful than it was before. And that's really what happens whenever we're able to kind of get some new metrics like that. And, if you're a pitching nerd who's just into, I'm going to say both the art and the science of pitching, because I think it's both. This is an exciting time to be following baseball. Like, be happy that this is the era of baseball you got to be around for, because we're making so many developments on being able to quantify this stuff and just to be able to understand it even more fully and appreciate it more fully, and just see pitching get to levels that the game has not seen for much of its history. I think it's really cool. So that's why I like looking at stuff like this and, trying to introduce other people to it and trying to explain it to others. So I just think it's neat that we get this kind of stuff. And Spencer, as a fellow pitching nerd, I'm sure you feel similarly.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's good for baseball. I think, like you said, it's not something that everyone has to love, but I think it is something that it helps to have a quantifiable way to look at different things. And it's like I say, it's not for everybody, but I do think just the ability to, have a little bit more proof behind what you might be seeing, or what you've always known, is never a bad thing. I think sometimes people will, like you say, like the nerds get a rep of being more, there are some people in that sphere who will talk down a little bit on people who don't look at baseball that way. And I don't think that's what it should be. I think it should be something that can kind of back up what we've known, and then maybe challenge us on certain things that we've thought we've known. And now we have a little bit of proof that can go the other direction and say, okay, maybe that's not exactly how things work. So in the pitching world, this is great for us specifically, but I think it's just a good thing for the sport to continue growing. And we keep seeing it, but pitching just keeps getting better. And the more we see stuff like this, along with the stuff plus type of things, and just the ability to get different movement on pitches, it's all really good for pitching. It's all creating, I don't know how I would describe it, but a more fun environment for pitching, I guess, in terms of what we're seeing in development and everything else. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's always cool to get these new metrics. And like you said, it's not meant to completely override everything that we've ever seen. It's just new numbers that can kind of show us what we already knew, or what we at least thought we knew.
Moving on to some less technical news, the Brewers announcing earlier in the week that former closer John Axford has been selected to the Wall of Honor. He'll be inducted with a ceremony sometime during the 2025 season. I'm sure most of the folks listening to the show remember Axford as the Brewers closer through parts of 2010, through parts of 2012. But in the middle of that stretch was a very memorable 2011 season during the Brewers' run to the NLCS. During that season, Axford set the single season saves record in franchise history at 46 saves that year. He also had 43 consecutive saves within that season. Then he would stretch that record to 49 consecutive saves between the 2011 and 2012 seasons. A memorable part of that era of Brewers baseball. So he'll get to join the Wall of Honor in 2025. Nothing really crazy here, but, Spencer, you obviously were very invested in that run as well. I know I've talked before, that was kind of the era when I started really getting into Brewers baseball a little bit more. Just any reaction from you, from your perspective, seeing that John Axford is going to get this kind of honor from the franchise?
Yeah, it's definitely deserved. Like you said, if you hold a franchise record for something like that in a single season, it's kind of hard not to give you that type of accomplishment or that type of honor. One of my favorite memories, ironically, I guess somewhat ironically, is the 2011 NLDS Game 5, where he actually did blow a save, and it was tied, and it was first and second, nobody out, after he had allowed the game tying run to score, and he ended up fighting through and getting out of it and keeping the score tied. And it was his first blown save. It didn't count towards that stretch, obviously, because it was a playoff game, but it was his first blown save in 43 chances, like you mentioned. And he was able to bear down and get out of it. And then it led to, obviously, the Nyjer Morgan walk-off, one of the coolest memories I have as a Brewers fan right now. And I just think that was a good way to kind of show exactly who he was as a player. He was somebody who it took him a while to reach the big leagues and be able to stick. And this was kind of the era of Brewers having closers like that. They had Axford, Jim Henderson, those types. But he was so good in his prime. He was locked down. He was a mid to upper 90s fastball with a nasty curveball. It was really good stuff. And he was fun to watch. And I mean, you say 49 games in a row. I don't care who you are. That's incredible to not have any really, not even a blow up, but any slip ups in that time is just extremely impressive. And yeah, I mean, it was very cool to me when he came back a few years ago. Unfortunately, that obviously didn't work out very well when he came back and hurt his elbow pretty much immediately in that game. But it was cool to see him back. He had a crazy baseball journey. His whole career is pretty insane. I mean, he had basically retired multiple times and then come back. It's a wild journey. You can read about it. There's some articles out there. He's talked about it on his Twitter before, but he even talked about how Bob Uecker helped him kind of make some decisions in terms of how he wanted to continue his baseball career after the elbow thing happened in Milwaukee the last time. But big part of Brewers history, definitely well-deserved, and he was very fun to watch during his prime.
I'm glad you brought up that Game 5 in 2011 of the NLDS, because, you talked about how he was able to get out of the inning. I was going to bring up, he came back out for a second inning, too, to set up that walk-off. He had already had the blown save, but he kept bearing down and then came back out for a second inning, worked a scoreless second inning, and then put the Brewers in a position where they were able to walk that game off. So again, just kind of speaking to how impressive he was during that stretch, even in a situation basically one of the only situation during that run where he did not get the job done. In a way, he still found a way to get a different job done, and the Brewers ended up winning. And those are the kind of things that I think that when you're talking about just very competitive guys, reliable guys to have at the back end of the bullpen. I know it was a short peak for him, but like you said, what he was able to do in that stretch of time, like the consecutive saves thing, it can be a flawed stat because, not every save situation is created equally, but still, like, no matter what, you're getting awarded a save in a close game, and to never have,
Yes.
like you said, any blowups in a close game for such a long, extensive stretch of time. Pretty impressive stuff. So congratulations to John Axford. The Brewers said that they will release more details pertaining to that ceremony once we get into the season. A little bit more off-season news. I'm surprised that this kind of flew under everybody's radar until you actually found the tweet and brought it up to me, Spencer. Garrett Mitchell's been working at Driveline Baseball this offseason. And, that in and of itself should kind of pique your attention if you're a very technical, nerdy baseball fan, because Driveline has been at the forefront of both pitching and offensive development for players for a good while now. But even more interesting to me, if you watch the video in that tweet, is what he was working on. So we've talked plenty about Garrett Mitchell on this program. Both of us have probably been among the most pessimistic about his outlook simply because we think that his weaknesses as a hitter are just too extreme to prevent the many, many tools he has from coming through. But the production has been good at the big league level so far. And I think the two of us have just kind of been waiting for it to give out over a longer sample, because the trends that we've seen and the stuff that we're valuing is, again, too extreme for us to believe it's going to hold up. But he's working on those exact issues. So the two things we've been worried about are, number one, the hole in the swing at the top of the zone. Like, he hasn't just been bad against those pitches. Like, there's a lot of hitters who are not good against those pitches, velocity at the top. But when you're talking about a guy who's got like a 75% whiff rate on velocity in some of these zones at the top, like, yeah, that's a huge deal. But the other issue has been that for a guy who has as much raw power as he does, he's a big ground ball hitter. He doesn't elevate the ball. And these are the two things that he appears to be working on at Driveline. In that particular video, they were going over his swing and basically putting him in a spot where, not only is he elevating the ball, but he also doesn't need to put a perfect swing on the ball to elevate it. And really what they were looking at is not only elevating, but elevating to the pull side, which is where you're going to tap into most of that power. Now, Spencer, is the guy who sent me this video to begin with, do you want to kind of run through what Garrett Mitchell appeared to be working on in that clip?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the main thing was definitely bat path. They were using what they call a long bat, which is just what it sounds like. It's a long bat. I don't know exactly how long it is, but I would imagine, or I've seen them before. I think they're about 8 to 9 inches longer than what you normally use in a bat. So it's about the same weight, but really what it's trying to do is train the path to be able to get your hands inside the ball, to be able to get your path on a good line, rather than, you can be short to the ball sometimes and get to it at the right point, especially in batting practice, but it doesn't have your bat in the zone for a long time. It doesn't have your bat in a good place for a long time. The long bat kind of prevents you from being able to get to it quickly without taking a good path to it. You kind of have to be on a good path in order to have the barrel in the right spot. So they were working on that specifically. They talked about how on pitches at the top, they're trying to get to this pull side power, like you mentioned, but they talked about at one point in the video how on pitches at the top of the zone, if you have the right path, if you're on just the right mechanically, everything's working correctly, you can be a little late. You can be not perfectly on time, but even a miss hit should be getting you a decent line drive up the middle as long as the bat path is in the right spot. And like you said, those are the two things that I think we have always had the most concern about, whether he actually gets to this raw power in games, whether he actually can at least hold his own on high fastballs. He doesn't have to be good at it. He just needs to make it so that it is not a complete, major, huge weakness for him, because The easiest way for me to describe it from my point of view is that this weakness is one of the few that can kind of be fatal for an offensive profile. It's one of those that if you just cannot figure it out, we've kind of seen it with Keston Hiura. It's if you can't figure that out, it can be really, really tough to find success, especially as pitchers get more used to how you operate as a hitter. Like you said, it's still a pretty small sample. I don't think he's really technically even at like a full season's worth of plate appearances, even though he's played in 3 different seasons so far. It's really good to see him working on these things. First of all, I will note, I think we talked about this at the time, but he mentioned it at one point late in the season that it was a specific thing he was starting to work on with the hitting coaches. That gave me a little hope. I think
he was working on getting pitches at the top. Like
yes.
I think that was after the game against the Giants where he actually homered on a high fastball.
Yeah.
That was the first time he got that was his very first hit against a high fastball in the big leagues. And I think it was Dom who asked about it post game. And Garrett was like, yeah, it's something that we've been working on. So like you at least knew like the seed had been planted.
Yes.
Which I guess in and of itself shouldn't be surprising. Like, of course, guys are going to want to work on their weaknesses, but still it's good to hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's always important for the player specifically to just be aware of his weaknesses. And like you said, it's something that he went into the end of the season. He's working on it. And now we see him go into the offseason. And it seems to be a clear point of emphasis for him that he's even seeking out, outside help on it. And from very, very good instruction that he's going to get at Driveline. Like you said earlier, it's always been kind of the premier outside, I don't even know what you'd call them, but just in terms of what they do for baseball players, they've always been ahead of the curve. They've always been doing things for both sides of the ball before most people, and they've helped a lot of players get better at their craft on both sides. So for Mitchell, again, to me, all I need to see is him capable of, putting the ball in play once in a while in that spot, continuing to make good swing decisions, which we can touch on in a second because Kurt Hogue wrote a very interesting article about that as well. But if he can just continue doing what he's doing in pretty much every other area of the zone, because pretty much every other area of the zone he has performed well, and he's been able to make solid contact at the bottom and in like the middle third of the zone on pretty much every pitch too. It's not like it's just fastball. He's been good against most pitches in other parts of the zone. But like I said, I think that upper third fastball can be a bit of a fatal thing for your offensive profile. So get me to a point where I'm seeing a decent amount of contact up there. It doesn't even need to be, huge home run power up there, but give me some singles, line a couple balls up the middle from there. Now all of a sudden pitchers can't just go, okay, I can just go there whenever I need a swing and miss. Then I start believing quite a bit more, I think, in the profile, and everything else he does on the baseball field is pretty good. He's very fast. He's a good defender. When the pitch is in his hot zones, he does quite a bit of damage on it. And even with a high ground ball rate, he does that. So there's a ton to like about Mitchell. We've always, despite what what you talked about, we are usually pretty low on him comparatively to everybody else. But at the same time, I think we always end the conversation with, but at the same time, there is a huge ceiling here if he can figure things out. And I guess over the course of the last 6 or so months, especially since I first heard him talk about working on the high fastball, now seeing it go into the offseason, I'm still not fully on board with Mitchell, but I would say my belief is at least a little bit higher that he's going to start figuring that part of it out enough to make himself a player that I actually believe in the production. Right now, I've seen the production, but I don't really believe it's sustainable. That's more what I'm trying to see is, can we get to a point where I see this production? If it just keeps continuing, I can't really argue with it. At some point, it just works. But at this point, it's still a small enough sample where I don't. And if I start seeing improvement in the one really big weakness, then I think it's going to be a lot harder to argue with the believers of Garrett Mitchell, because everything else he does, like I said, is pretty impressive on the baseball field.
He has my attention now is maybe the way to put it. Like,
yeah,
I've always been, I don't know if stubborn's the right word, but pretty firm in my belief that he just was not going to get to the ceiling because these issues are so bad. And like I said, like years of seeing like a Keston Hira and other guys like that have been like, nope, I'm not going to let myself believe in this because we know it doesn't work.
Right.
But now when you start to see stuff like this come out, now, you kind of, you're like that lady in the meme who like she's shaking her head at something first and then all of a sudden like she kind of changes her mind a little bit. I probably sound like an old man trying to describe like what's hip and popular these days whenever I try to describe a meme. But can you believe I'm 22 going on 23? I feel like sometimes I talk like I'm like, I don't know, at least twice that age. But anyway, he has my attention now, to the point where it's like if he's working on it and it's getting better, like it does become, like you said, a little easier to see a path now where, okay, even if those issues just go from, you know, from a total inability to do this to now it's just a weakness like
Mhm.
that, because that's how extreme he's been in some of these areas, which is why I feel like I've taken a pretty hard line stance on it. But now, all of a sudden, if this is getting a little bit better and it's at least something he can do sometimes, it definitely changes the outlook a little bit. And, to be clear, like we've always wanted to see Garrett Mitchell
Yeah.
succeed. Like you never want to see a player do poorly. You just, at the same time, if we're trying to give analysis, we want to try to be honest about, some potential pitfalls that he might run into, and just, I don't want to say objective, because it is like taking the factors that we like to look at and forming our opinion on it, but like maybe fair or like uncompromising is a better way to
Mhm.
put it. Like even uncompromising has kind of a negative connotation, but I think you get the point that I'm trying to hammer at here, where like just because you want a player to do well does not mean you're going to turn a blind eye to what you can clearly see as weaknesses that have historically led to failure for other players in the past. But again, if he's working on this stuff, it does pique my interest or pique my attention, like I said. And another part of this, piece of this Garrett Mitchell puzzle is what you talked about that Kurt wrote. And, you know, I was in the clubhouse for the entire season. Like I picked up pretty quickly. I think everybody picked up pretty quickly how deeply the Brewers value swing decisions. I think I had dropped the nugget on this pod before about how the Brewers have proprietary metrics where they evaluate guys' swing decisions. They're never going to let us see them, obviously, but they have them. And Kurt took his own stab at trying to, quantify it himself and come up with kind of like a public version of this metric. Again, we don't know what the Brewers put into their metric, but like we have pitch tracking data here. We can try to piece things together. And that's what Kurt did. And basically the way he went about it, not to summarize his entire article and prevent you from reading it because you absolutely should. It's really good stuff. Like I had thought in my head about doing something like this myself, but Kurt did it way better than I possibly could have. So he went in and he looked at not only, you know, are you swinging at pitches in the zone and not swinging at pitches out of the zone? That's like the very basic version of good swing decisions. He also looked at, are you swinging at the pitches that you can do damage on? Are you swinging at the pitches you hit the best? And then are you laying off the pitches that you don't hit? Because a lot of times, like sometimes, especially before you get to 2 strikes, it can be better to just spit on the pitch that you're not going to hit and then see if, because you still have time left in that at bat or in that plate appearance, see if you then get one that you can hit and then swing at that one. And what he came away with is Garrett Mitchell has some of the best swing decisions on this roster, at least according to this kind of metric and the factors that he was looking at. And I guess that doesn't shock me a ton because he had spent a lot of his time before we talked about getting to the high fastball. He already had set a goal going into spring training last year of laying off the high fastball, not chasing it. And it worked. Like he was really good at not chasing that pitch. The part where he still ran into trouble is when guys threw it in the zone. And then he would, have to swing at it because it was in the zone. But when it was, above the zone, he usually did not chase. So it's, again, the issue was never really that he couldn't recognize pitches, but just that there was something about like his swing plane or his bat path that was preventing him from getting to that. So if he's, got the good swing decisions already, and now he's going to Driveline and he's actually working on like the physical aspect of it and getting himself mechanically in a position where, maybe not even necessarily crushing that pitch, but at least being able to protect against it. Because really, when you're talking about like high velocity, again, not a lot of guys can hit that. If you can't hit it, really, it's more about just can you protect against it? Like, can you foul back a high fastball and keep yourself alive for when you get that pitch that you can drive? That's a big part of hitting too. Like, can you just spoil the pitches that you can't hit instead of being, completely overpowered by them and then your at bat's over? So if Garrett Mitchell can get to that point, like we've been saying in kind of a long-winded way here, the profile, as interesting as it was already, gets even more exciting because now you start to see a little bit of a path to reaching that ceiling that I think both of us for the longest time just thought was never really something he was going to reach.
Yeah. And I mean, to be clear, I feel like we should kind of spell out what the ceiling is. The ceiling, if he's healthy, is genuinely one of the better players in baseball. Like there is as much ceiling here. I think Churio's the only person who can argue that he has a higher ceiling in the Brewers, young system, at least in terms of young players in MLB or in the minors. With the raw power that he has, with the speed, with the defense, with, just everything he brings to the table. If he can actually figure out this weakness, man, there's like 5-6 WAR seasons in there for him where he is a legitimate all-star. I do think we should always mention that health will always be a concern with him too. He has proven to have some issues with health, but assuming he is healthy, the sky is the limit for him. It's just, like you said, it's been harder to see any real version of him reaching that ceiling. Now it's starting to become a little bit more possible. At least it seems a little bit more possible right now than it has before.
With that, we're going to pivot to a couple of listener questions for the week. We'll start with, we actually got a few interesting ones this week. Not that any of the other ones are bad, but like these take us down some paths that I don't think we've necessarily talked about a whole lot before. But before we get to that, we'll just talk about a couple of questions generally relating to the offseason, the way this roster is currently constructed. Thunder McRobert asked us on Twitter, this team is clearly lacking one more power bat. Can this team win consistently being in the bottom third in homers and being right about average, or after being right about average last year? Or will the bump from Churio, a healthy Yelich, steps from Joey Ortiz, Sal Frelick, make lack of power a moot point? I think we already touched on this a little bit in our last episode, but Spencer, I'll kind of let you take the lead first here. But my guess is it's just going to be kind of reiterating what we talked about last time, just with like how there's a very big range of outcomes here.
Yeah, that's really the thing here. I think there is absolutely a world where they make up for the Willy Adames power internally with people on the team already. Mitchell could be one of those people. Curio, I think we absolutely could see more than 20 or 21 homers like he hit last year. Yelich was on pace for quite a few homers before he got hurt. And if you get a healthy version of Yelich, yeah, there's absolutely more power in there. Honestly, Reese, I don't really think you'd get too much more home run power out of this next year. Maybe a few, but I think on that note, we're probably just hoping for more in the other forms of his offense than just the home run power. I think everything else is what we're hoping for a little bit better from him. But yeah, Ortiz, I think you could see a little more power. I think Frelick potentially. Obviously, we saw him hit the hardest hit ball and the furthest ball of his career, and pretty much that probably was his last at bat of the season. But there are ways where they could make up for this. Oliver Dunn's another one internally who you could see having a decent power season. But I think there is also definitely a world where they fall into that, bottom third, like you mentioned, in homers. And that does become concerning at any point when you don't have the power. It's hard to win in the postseason. I don't think it would necessarily ruin my view of them in the regular season next year. I think they could probably still be pretty competitive, but I do think that's one of those things that when you get to the playoffs, you do need to have that power. And the Brewers actually hit some homers in that Mets series. Obviously, the Mets just ended up hitting the biggest homer, but you need to have that power in the playoffs. And if there's anything that I am concerned about with this roster, I would say that's probably the biggest thing is I do worry about the power. Like I said, I think there's a world where they're just fine in that department and a lot of guys take steps forward. And I think that's very possible, but it does have a wide range and that does leave me a little bit concerned.
Second question from him, and this can be a quick one. What is one pitcher's pitch, excluding Craig Yoho's changeup, that you were excited to see in Milwaukee in 2025? I'll go first on this one. And I'm going to try to make like a little bit more of a dark horse pick. Nick Mears' slider. I think that's always been an underrated part of his arsenal. I think in general, he's just a guy a lot of people are overlooking because, he became a home run machine down the stretch last year. He also missed like a month before he was able to come back late in September. But again, we did see in that Mets series, like how electric everything can be when it's all going right. And he's not running into the barrels with the fastball because he's locating a little bit better. But I think the breaking stuff is really big for him because when he was someone who came over here right away, my first thought was, okay, they can do something to make the breaking stuff pair even better with the fastball because that's really what Trevor McGill did when he came over here. It was already something I think he was planning on doing when the Brewers acquired him, but then they kind of helped him along with it. And I think Nick Mears is in a very similar spot. So the Brewers already had him make the adjustment that I would have had him made, which is stop throwing that big curveball so much, and we're going to go way more slider to pair with that fastball. And he did start getting a lot more chase on both of those pitches when he did it. Granted, there was the home run issue, which is another discussion to have, and it's obviously something that needs to get better for him. But I just the thought of him getting an actual offseason with the Brewers guidance, or at least them spelling out kind of what they want him to work on, I think that slider is going to be a very, very good pitch for him. Like if he comes back and it's even tighter than it was last year, I think there's the makings of a pitch that has like a 50% whiff rate in that slider. So I'm very excited to see what that's going to look like. It's probably not, what you would necessarily think of when you think of like the nastiest Brewers pitches or the nastiest looking Brewers pitches like Craig Yoho's changeup, but that's going to be my pick.
It's a good pick. I did not go the dark horse route. I guess maybe it's not somebody who had debuted with the Brewers yet either, but I do want to see Jacob Mizorowski's fastball. I just think it's, when you look at the metrics on it, it is basically Zach Wheeler's fastball, except he throws it like 4 miles per hour harder. And Wheeler's fastball is one of the best fastballs in all of baseball. So I'm very excited to see that, whatever role it is in. I'm very excited to see him throwing it in MLB. And I mean, it would have been an easy pick on Yoho, so I'm glad you gave me the qualifier that I could not use that one because it absolutely would have been my pick. But yeah, we're going to see Miz at one point, assuming he's healthy. I'm almost certain of that. It might be out of the pen. It probably will be out of the pen, but that might even help it play up a little bit more. Might see a little bit more velo in a shorter role. So very excited to see that one.
Andrew asked us, with the Cubs recently getting Ryan Presley, former Astros closer, how do you think their bullpen compares to ours now? So when we got this question, I'll admit I hadn't really looked at the Cubs bullpen, but I was like, yeah, this is a good question because I wonder how this bullpen does look. And then I looked at the bullpen, and right away, I think as we both looked at it, our thoughts are pretty quickly, oh, they're really still not that close to the Brewers. A couple of reasons for that opinion. Number one, Presley is not a bad get. I'll spell that out first. But I think he's on the decline. This is a guy who is, these last couple of years he's still been fine. He's been a perfectly solid back end kind of guy, but not the same guy he was in his peak with Houston. I mean, this is a guy who, if you look at the strikeout rate year by year, is a pretty good place to start here. 2021, 32%. 2022, 35%. Even if you go back to 2019 and 2020, it's 35 to 30%, 31%. Then you look at the last 2 years. So, like I said, 2022, almost a 36% strikeout rate. 2023 down to 27.6. 2024 down to 23.8, his lowest strikeout rates since 2015. And in 2015, he only pitched in like 25 innings that year with the Twins. The velocity's going down a little bit as well. The ERA has gone from being, like crazy dominant in the low to mid twos to now he's in like the mid threes. I think he's going to be solid for the Cubs, assuming they put him into that ninth inning. But I don't think he's going to be, like a guy who you necessarily need to be scared of, like a guy who you look at and you think, oh man, like this Cubs bullpen is something that I'm really afraid of now. I mean, you look at the way the rest of this is constructed. Yes, there is a world in which the Cubs have a really good bullpen if things go right for them. Like if you would have looked at some of the groups that the Brewers are running out of the past couple of years, like a lot of people outside of Milwaukee probably would have thought the Brewers didn't have a great bullpen, but like you've got Tyson Miller still slotted in for a high leverage role. I liked Tyson Miller when the Brewers had him briefly, so I'm not surprised it came together for him in Chicago last year. But at the same time, he seems a little bit more like a middle relief arm to me. I like Julian Merriweather, but he's basically never been healthy for the past couple of years, so that's a question as well. Really, the one guy in this Cubs bullpen who I like quite a bit is Porter Hodge, and he's also one of the younger members of that group, and he already started out with a pretty impressive showing in his rookie season, so I think the more development he gets, he has the potential to become someone who's pretty scary. Nate Pearson, another guy with good stuff in that pen, but it really just still has not come together for him. The control and command haven't quite been where they need to be. The walks actually did go down quite a bit, but it looks like he was still hit fairly hard. Like the home run rate's not good. The average exit velocity against is still up there as well. So he's kind of like I don't want to say all or nothing, but like, yes, you can see how the stuff could become very dominant, but so far he's several seasons into his career now, and it really just has not quite come together the way everybody's been hoping. I still think this Brewers bullpen is quite a bit better. Is the Cubs bullpen fine? Yes. Have they made some moves to shore it up a little bit after it was pretty bad for most of last year? Yes, that's the other thing you got to remember too. Like, the reason why the Cubs have made so many moves is because their bullpen was pretty bad for a good chunk of last season. They did start to right the ship a little bit down the stretch in the second half, especially, but given, not only where they started, but also like the kind of guys who they have brought in. Yes, if everything breaks right, maybe they compete with the Brewers, but I would still take that Milwaukee bullpen by a pretty good margin over that Cubs bullpen, because I think number one, it's just better stuff all around. But number two, I think some of them already have refined that stuff better than a lot of these Cubs relievers. And number three, I would trust the Brewers more to refine anything that has not yet been refined than I would trust, the folks over in Chicago.
Yeah, I agree. I've got nothing to add on that one.
Last couple questions came from Royce, and these are the ones that I thought were really interesting. We'll start with the pitching one just because, pitching nerds running this show. He asks, how much can a good pitching lab improve the characteristics of a four-seamer? Example, high velocity but flat. Spencer, you want to start with this one since I took the last question?
Yeah, I mean, I think an important thing to remember with a lot of pitching stuff is that there is still always going to be different limitations on every pitcher. There are certain things some people can do and can't do. A lot of it is kind of related to, honestly, flexibility in the arm and just the way your arm moves naturally. So some guys aren't going to be able to, if they have a flat four seam, you're probably going to have to go a different route and maybe go with a two seam or a cutter and try and find a different way to make this movement work. But there are certain things you can do to just kind of tweak pitches. And one big thing is just going to be more pure backspin. If you're trying to get more carry on the ball, that's one thing that teams might be able to tinker with and get a little bit more out of a guy than what he's been giving in the past. I think at the major league level, a lot of that stuff isn't going to improve much because especially nowadays, these guys are going through the minors and getting a lot of this training. So it's a little harder to see it on the surface because We don't get access to all of that stuff when they're in the lower levels of the minors, but the teams do. But really, the main thing is you can improve different pitches. A lot of times it's going to be based on what your limitations are. So, for example, the team we work with, we have a ton of people who cannot pronate, meaning basically pronating is the direction your arm would normally go for a changeup. If you think about Devin Williams throwing a changeup and how his hand turns over the ball, that's pronating. Supinating is what you would consider what they do on a curveball or slider, something like that. So for a lot of people, if you can only supinate, it's going to be hard to throw a two-seam. There are certain ways to do it. You can use seam shifted wake, a lot of things that we're not going to get into the super deep depths of all of this here, but there are a lot of things you can do. But really, I think the main thing is, for me, you do have to keep in mind what pitchers are capable of. So it's really a case by case thing. There's not really a way to say, yeah, every team could bring this guy in and make him throw a high carry fastball, because not every person is capable of it. But the pitching labs and everything that these teams have, they're going to look into every possibility. I think that's a main thing here. They are going to look into what guys can do, and then they're going to try and maximize them. And I think the Brewers were ahead of the curve on a lot of these things. Now, I think what people consider the pitching lab, which I think we've talked about it on here before, but like what people consider the pitching lab is really more just something that's they do everywhere. They do it. They have TrackMan set up all over the place. They have different machines they've got them all over the place at spring training, behind the mounds, picking up every pitch in their bullpens. They've got them when they do live at bats on the field during the season. Like they have them all over the place. The pitching lab really is more of a mechanical based. Basically, they're trying to make sure you're getting the most out of your mechanics. They're trying to make sure you're getting, there's like an example is they have like plates in the mound so they can measure the force that you're putting into the ground when you're landing and those types of things. So I think that's where other teams are catching up to the Brewers now, but where the Brewers were ahead of a lot of people. The pitching lab's not really about actual pitch development. So I'm just throwing that out as a clarification, because I think that's what a lot of people consider it. And I guess to some degree, it is basically a pitching lab, but when the Brewers refer to their pitching lab, that's not really what they're talking about for the most part. Either way, that's the main point from my perspective here, is that it depends on the player more than anything else, but there are always things you can do to change or to maximize what a player is capable of.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is I think you can turn a mediocre pitch into a good pitch.
Yes.
Like a good version of that pitch. But ironically, actually, to come back to this question in particular, fastballs are actually probably the one where it's hardest to transform a bad one from a good one while staying within that same kind of fastball, because they exist in way more restrictive boxes, I think, as far as what works and what doesn't. Like, if you're throwing a four-seamer, for it to be a good four-seamer, there needs to be like kind of a carry effect to it, especially if you're not able to get a lot of arm side movement. So you accomplish that by getting basically the right combination of ride, but also coming from the right kind of arm slot. Like, that's where vertical approach angle comes in. It really does a good job of just tracking, like, how good are you at making that fastball a pitch that hitters are likely to swing under, because it's going to look like it's not coming down as much as you would expect the pitch to on its way to the plate. That's really what the four-seamer is about. If you can't do that, you're basically almost always going to see guys transition to throwing like a two-seamer, or maybe they try a cutter if they are a little bit more. The supination bias thing is a little tricky to get into, because depending on the guy, like Spencer alluded to, his seam shifted wake, you actually can throw a really, really good sinker if you supinate, but it depends on the guy a little bit. You got to be in kind of like the right range of how much you cut the ball to make that work. So it can depend on the guy a little bit. But generally speaking, like, if you cannot get the right kind of spin on a certain fastball, instead of trying to develop that right kind of spin, you're far more likely to see a pitcher just throw a different kind of fastball that he's more likely to be able to get the right kind of spin on based on how his body naturally moves. So again, like if you have a guy who's pretty close on the four seamer and maybe it's just not quite as efficient as they'd like, then yes, there's stuff you can do. Like I know Devin Williams, for example, he used to, when he was here, he would toss. I don't know if there's anyone listening who like has done coaching, like in high school or college. Maybe you've heard of this. It's this little. It's called Clean Fuego, and I'm not doing this as like a promotional thing. But basically, it's like if someone took a baseball and like sliced it into thirds, and you only keep the middle third.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what you're throwing, it's like if someone turned a base. It's like if someone took a baseball and cut out the middle of it as like a hockey puck, and you're throwing the hockey puck with the seams on it. And what it's designed to do is like make sure that you're staying behind the baseball because that's the only way you're going to be able to get really pure spin. And if you're not doing it when you throw that hockey puck, it's going to kind of wobble a little bit. If you are doing it the right way, it's not going to wobble. So like Devin Williams would throw that around all the time to make sure that he could do that. But he also had so much dexterity that it was something that he knew he could do. That was just his way of making sure that he was doing it like absolutely as best he could but he was really good at spinning the ball really efficiently. And it does help when you're a pronator that a lot of times makes it easier to do that. If you're not someone who can do that, usually it makes a lot more sense to just not even waste your time trying to figure that out because that's not the way you naturally move. And this is where I'm going to come back to, I think I've said this before. Rob Zastryzny told me this when I was asking him about how he refined his pitch mix for a story I did on him when he was briefly in the bullpen, because he basically overhauled his entire arsenal. And, he kind of backed this up. He said, there is kind of a faction of people who misconstrue what pitching analytics and pitch shapes and all of this and pitch development are all about. It's not about going in and, you can just kind of scroll through like a catalog of pitches and just pick out whichever one you want and build your arsenal that way. No, really what it's about is this technology. It helps quantify the way you're moving. And by understanding the way that your body moves, that's when you start to get an idea of like, okay, these are the kind of pitches I can throw. So like in Zastryzny's case, he was wasting his time trying to top spin a curveball. Well, it turns out that the way his hand moves and the way his body moves, he can't actually like get on top of the ball and top spin it like that to throw a curveball. What he can do is get on the side of the ball and get a lot of side spin. They found that out because as soon as he left the Cubs, he got on all these machines. And when they found that out, and he did this, he told me it was like an outside facility. It wasn't when he was with any team. He found it over the offseason when he was like training at kind of like a Driveline like facility. And what they found is because he could get on the side of the ball so well and side spin it, they were like, well, instead of wasting your time trying to top spin when you actually can't do that, let's develop a sweeper, because a sweeper is all about let's get as much side spin as we can, to really get that lateral movement on the pitch. And that's what he developed. And he kind of fine-tuned some of this stuff. And then by the time he came to the Brewers, he was now four-seam sweeper cutter, an occasional changeup too. But the curveball was gone. The cutter was an addition to his arsenal as well, because again, like if you're a guy who naturally, gets on that side of the ball a little bit more, like with your, like the back of your hand, like facing like out instead of in towards you, that can also make it a little bit easier to throw like a cutter too. So this is kind of a long-winded answer, but it seems like based on the question, you kind of wanted us to dive into this a little bit. It's not really so much about like improving. Again, it depends on the pitch. Like, yes, there are pitches where there like are certain cues you're going to give guys to like improve the qualities of it. But for this specific question, like a four-seamer, there are also pitches where, you get to a point where it's like, okay, if we're just not even close to getting it where it needs to be, we can recognize that this is just probably not something you're going to be able to accomplish. So instead of trying to fix it, we're going to do something else that plays into the way your body moves a lot better. So like, again, for this question, if it's high velo, and by flat, I'm assuming you mean like in a bad way, like straight and just not a lot of carry to it, then you're probably going to see a guy switch to a sinker. That was actually, we talked about Bukauskas earlier in the show. That's exactly what he did. When he was with Arizona, he originally threw a four-seamer. It was terrible because that's just not the way he's wired. He's not wired to throw that kind of pitch. Once he starts throwing the sinker, now guess what? He's actually wired in a way where he can get like a crazy amount of depth on that sinker. So it was a good thing instead of trying to fix the fastball, he just went with an entirely different pitch. And unfortunately, the health hasn't been on his side, but the actual effectiveness of it when he has been on the mound has worked in his favor. We got one more question from Royce as well. And this is another one that I don't think gets talked about a lot. So he, sticking somewhat on the pitching side of it, he asked, can a position player with a subpar arm improve it via methods that pitchers use to gain velo? I can't think of ever hearing it. Is it a risk of arm injury for a position player? Or is there a risk of arm injury for a position player? And is it too much risk for minor reward?
Yeah. So to answer the second part of that, I think this is something that position players definitely do in the offseason. And I'm sure they do it throughout the season as well. I know Mike Trout talked about it a lot when he first came up to MLB, and he has improved his arm strength over the course of his career. In the question, you had mentioned Christian Yelich, who we have seen some improvement on since he came to the Brewers. It doesn't show up as much in the average arm strength on Baseball Savant, but his max throws have gone up over time. And I think for the outfielders, max kind of matters a little bit more because it's measuring a lot of throws that might not necessarily be super competitive from the outfield. It's trying to measure competitive throws, I know, but there's a lot of throws that are made where it's like, okay, we're getting it in, but we're not really letting it loose. So seeing the max go up pretty significantly for Yelich, I feel like shows that he has been improving the arm strength. But in terms of what they do, they actually do use some programs that are very similar to pitchers. Driveline has a weighted ball program for pitchers, but they also have one available to position players. There are many long toss programs that are built for position players versus pitchers. There are a lot of ways they work on these things. And there's also just, mechanical ways you can help improve a throw from the outfield or from the infield or whatever. It can be getting a better base in the infield, getting your legs underneath you a little bit better. Jack, I think you mentioned before we started, but for Yelich, I believe they were mostly working on release point with him, right? In terms of trying to get the arm strength up a little bit. And that can help too. I mean, getting it out in front more allows you to get a little bit behind it, a little bit extra behind it. So there are a lot of things they can do even beyond just pure, arm strength improvement. It can be mechanical stuff, just like a pitcher has, where we've seen it plenty over the years, especially at, lower levels than MLB, but I'm sure it still gets to MLB sometimes, where guys just don't use their legs very well. They don't have great footwork, whether that's infield or outfield. So you can improve upon that just with tiny little tweaks to that. And you might not ever notice it with the naked eye, but it's probably something they worked on for weeks and months on end to try and improve that stuff. And it's not talked about a lot. Like Jack mentioned, and like Royce mentioned in the question, it isn't talked about a lot. We did hear about it a little bit with Yelich, I remember a couple of years ago, but it's an important part of the equation for some of these guys. It does matter. I know Breland Payne, the Brewers' first round pick last year, has mentioned that he wants to improve his arm strength as he continues climbing the ladder. It's something that he's really focused on. So for the players, it's always a pretty important part of the equation. I do think it's something that we, in the public, don't maybe talk about a lot, but they do a lot of different things. There are a lot of different, ways to go about it, but it is something I'm sure is focused on more internally than it is talked about externally.
With that, we will transition to the final segment of our show, Spencer's favorite. It's the minor league sandbox. Spencer, what have you got for us this week?
Yeah, we've got a quick little winter league update because I need to give Justin Yeager a little bit of a shout out. He won. He was pitching in Puerto Rico. He won the Reliever of the Year award down there. He led the league in saves, and in the postseason, he had 7 saves and helped send his team to the Caribbean Series, which I believe is starting in a few days. So he had a really solid season in Double-A. Yeager was part of the William Contreras, Yoel Payamps return in the Ruiz trade with the A's. He came from the Braves in that deal, but he was really solid in Biloxi, having a great, winter league season here. He pitched pretty well in the AFL last offseason, the offseason prior to this one. There's still stuff to like here. He was Rule 5 eligible. He wasn't really somebody anybody expected to get protected. I believe he's a minor league free agent this next offseason if he is not added to the 40-man, but there's definitely something to like here. There's some pretty big velo. There's a pretty good looking slider. So having a great winter league. So shout out to him for that. But the only other thing I want to talk about really is, I don't have a ton here. Like I said, I'm very tired, so I didn't put together a ton here, but there's been a ton of top 100 updates around really the baseball stratosphere right now. And the Brewers were pretty well, I mean, they were in every single list. There were 4 names that were on every single list. Jesus Mate, Jefferson Cairo, Jacob Mizorowski, and Cooper Pratt made every list that has come out recently. On Baseball America, Mate was number 17, Cairo was 43, Miz was 44, and Cooper Pratt was number 50. On Baseball Prospectus, Mate was 35, Cairo was 61, Pratt was 64, Miz was 65. Pipeline, MLB Pipeline, Cairo was number 47, Mate was number 56, Pratt was number 57, and Miz was number 100, so just snuck in. The Athletic, which is just Keith Law, really, had Cairo number 15, Cooper Pratt number 44, Mate 78, and Jacob Mizorowski 87. He also had Tyler Black at number 56, and he also ranked the Brewers as the number 10 system in all of baseball. And then ESPN came out with their top 100 a few days ago, and then they also came out with their 101 to 200. I believe it was today or yesterday. So on their top 100, it was the same 4. Mate, number 46, Pratt, 48, Cairo, 49, Miz was number 68, and then in the 101 to 200 range, he had Luke Adams, number 126, Luis Pena, number 145, Tyler Black at 166, Brock Wilken at 180, Eric Batanti at 191, and Mike Bovee at 194. So the main takeaway here for me is that, one, Mate is pretty consistently getting ranked extremely highly for somebody who is 17 years old, has only played in the DSL. Jackson Chourio, we did not see get ranked this highly until he had already been in low A Carolina. He had already shown what he could do. And honestly, that didn't even happen until late in that season. Baseball America jumped on it really quickly, but it took the other ones pretty much till the end of the season to even start putting him in their top 100. That's the type of data that Mate was putting up in the DSL, a 104 90th percentile exit velocity, only a 15% chase, and a whiff rate that was only around 10%. I mean, it's unbelievable numbers that he put up. He had great swing decisions. He made great contact, and he made tons of contact. Everybody's pretty much on board with it. Even the ones who, like, for the Athletic, Keith Law put him at number 78, but he basically said, like, I don't rank DSL guys this high ever. If he shows anything close to what he did in the DSL when he gets the full season ball, he's going to fly up the list even further. So even the people who are a little bit lower on him in terms of the rankings basically said something along those lines in terms of, like, we don't ever put people this high, but we kind of feel like we have to because everything points to just being a complete outlier of a player last year in the DSL. And then for Miz, he was kind of the one with the widest range on a lot of these. A lot of it came down to relief profile for some of these different websites and different rankers, I guess. But even, again, for Keith Law, he mentioned he put him at 87 in his write-up. He basically said he thinks Law has been consistent, I will say, on this. He's always thought he was a reliever. But he even says, he's like, I think he's probably one of the best relievers in baseball when he comes up, even if he is stuck in the bullpen. So I still have to put him on this list because that's how much value he's still going to be able to bring out of the bullpen. So it's a fun time, again, for the Brewers system. I think we've seen a lot of respect given to the system the last few years. I think everyone kind of expected it to take a little bit of a step back with Chourio graduating and some of the other names that have graduated the last couple of years, but then they just keep popping up new names. I think the only other thing I want to touch on here is Jefferson Cairo. He didn't really move much in terms of where he was before the injury, before he missed essentially the entire season last year. The only reason I think that's kind of notable, I would imagine a lot of these people did research in terms of trying to figure out what the concern level should be on the shoulder before ranking him. I can't imagine they flew in there blind and just said, we'll just assume the shoulder is fine. So it makes me, at least it gives me a little hope that there are good signs in terms of where the arm is at, and that he will hopefully be back in a good place, because if the arm is back where it was, I mean, I still think this is a guy who has top 5 catcher in baseball potential. It's a special defensive profile with a huge arm. And then on offense, it's a guy with legitimate game power and pretty good bat to ball skills, even though I wouldn't say he makes the best swing decisions. It's good bat to ball with power and great defense. You don't find too many of those guys in the league. Normally you get one or the other with the catcher spot. It's usually offense or defense. I think Cairo has a chance to bring both to the table pretty well. So that's pretty much all I got for the minor league sandbox this time. Like I said, didn't have the energy to put too much together. I wanted to do more winter league updates, but I figured I should get Yeager in because he's been so incredible over there, and it's been a really impressive year for him. Really, he's been good for the majority of the year. So yeah.
I'll cut you some slack on not having more this week, given what you've been through over the last couple days. Otherwise, I'd really be making fun of you. But thank you all for tuning in this week. Again, the slow offseason continues, but there's always plenty to dive into, as we've learned from the fact that we still managed to make this into like an hour and a half program. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed recording this. We hope you enjoy all of these shows as much as we enjoy recording them. Once again, we will be back sticking on the every other week upload schedule as long as the offseason continues, but that's going to change pretty quickly here. Once pitchers and catchers report, I think we're going to go back to the weekly format. So
yeah,
you'll be hearing even more of us. If that is good news for you, bad news for you, I'm not sure. To each his own. But as always, thank you all for listening. We'll talk to you again in a couple weeks.